Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is John Horrigan, and today I'd like to make a presentation to you on some of the old roads that we travel. And my presentation today is brought to you by the WAYLAND Council on Aging. We're going to talk about early American roads and trails. And up front, I'd like to have a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed on Waycam television are those of the author, me, John Horrigan, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the WAYLAND Council on Aging or the WAYLAND Community Access and Media Incorporated. So, any content that I provide, John Horrigan, is of my own personal opinion and research and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. And when I use the term Indian, I do not mean it in a derogatory sense. Native Americans, indigenous peoples, First Nation tribes, etc., are all interchangeable appellations. Now, this is a text-driven presentation for the benefit of folks like me who may have difficulty hearing. Any audio or technical issues in the production of this presentation are due to my lack of any technical acumen. I'm all thumbs. Maybe one day I'll be able to make a live presentation to all of you at the Council on Aging. But until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay strong. And I'd love to hear from you. There's always somebody who knows more about the following subject than I do. So feel free to contact me at johnhorrigan@hotmail.com or find me on Facebook under J.R. Horrigan or John Horrigan, historian, pro sports announcer. So we're looking at early American roads and trails, but we have a focus on early roads and trails of Massachusetts. I'll bring the WAYLAND aspect into this. I hosted a program called The Folklorist, and I was the host, writer, and co-creator of the TV show The Folklorist, and I was lucky to win 5 Boston, New England Emmy Awards. And you can find the show on YouTube, just search Folklorist, or you can go to www.folklorist.tv. That'll bring you to the YouTube channel. But I was lucky enough to get 20 Boston, New England Emmy Award nominations, received 13 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and New TV out of Newton, Mass. Went back-to-back first place nationally in arts and entertainment, according to the Alliance of Community Media in 2015 and 2016. But unfortunately, it was the critically acclaimed show that nobody was watching. So it was canceled in September of 2016. But I was very lucky to have participated. Now, today's roads are the roads of yesterday. We travel by automobile on ancient footpaths that have been used for over a millennium. And this talk will be light on technical and engineering aspects in regard to surveying, grading, leveling, blasting, clearing, quarries, etc. But let's never forget how efficient and smooth our roads are today. Of course, until springtime when the temperatures change and potholes emerge. So the next time somebody asks you for directions, maybe you can just play along as if you were back in the 17th century. Travel around 3 miles of the Bay Path and then take the left fork to the old Connecticut Path and continue on to the lower Boston Post Road. And they'll probably give you a strange look. But WAYLAND is in the path of history. The old Connecticut Path, which we'll chat about later, runs right through WAYLAND. In fact, it's Route 126, right off of Route 20. And of course, Route 20 has its history as well, because that's the Henry Knox Trail. That's the trail that Henry Knox took in late 1775 and in early 1776. He collected 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and brought them 300 miles south along the Hudson River, across the Berkshire Mountains, and into Boston using oxen and sleds and horses. And eventually these cannons were placed atop Dorchester Heights. The British at that point decided that Boston wasn't worth it. They evacuated Boston March 17th, 1776, known as Evacuation Day. Maybe sometime I can present that to you. But the Knox Trail, as you can see, very famous trail. There are all sorts of historical markers along the trail, as well as one right here in WAYLAND. And you can just see it there, and you probably have seen this and haven't stopped to read it. If you can sometime, do it safely. So we'll look at early American roads and highways, primitive roads and routes, early American explorer trails, the Nemasket Path, the Old Coast Path, the Watertown Path, the Bay Path, the Old Connecticut Path, also known as the Great Trail, the Bay Road, also known as the Old Roebuck Road, the Boston Post Road, also known as King's Highway. It's a portion of King's Highway, and the Mohawk Trail, also known in New York as the Iroquois Trail. And then if we have time, we'll talk about I-90. So trails and footpaths were developed over tens of thousands of years as pedestrian passageways between settlements and villages for hunting game, and eventually as thoroughfares for trade. Some were simply modified animal paths, and they tended to track alongside rivers, lakes, bays, and coastal areas, traverse flatland areas, and travel through settlements. By about 10,000 BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era, roads were rough and they were used by human travelers. Roads essentially were widened mass paths. They were required to accommodate increasing pedestrian traffic along original routes, as settlers would walk to market centers or to their local place of government or to their local place of worship. Now, when we talk about beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, that's prior to the settlers coming to North America, South America, Central America, the only beast of burden they had native was the llama. So the settlers brought along the big six, as I call them, beasts of burden horses. They also brought cattle. They brought chickens. They brought pigs. They brought sheep and goats. And after the adaptation of beasts of burden as faster and more efficient mode of transportation, and the carts and wagons that they would tow, these trails were extended, widened, and their surfaces became more compressed. And eventually lanes were required to ensure that traffic proceeded orderly and more readily in each direction. Now, log roads date back to 4000 BC, and they've been found in Glastonbury, England. Something known as the Sweet Track. It's a timber track causeway in England and one of the oldest engineered roads ever discovered in Northern Europe. And it was built in 3807 BC, according to tree ring dating. Now, the Plumstead Trackway was discovered in Plumstead, London, England in 2009, and it's 6,000 years old. Stone-paved streets were found in the ancient city of Ur in the Sumerian region, in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the Middle East, dating back to 4000 BC. Now, brick-paved streets were often used in India as early as 3000 BC, but the world's oldest known paved road was laid in Egypt at Weden al-Faras sometime between the years 2600 and 2200 BC. And then there was the Persian Royal Road. It was 1,700 miles traveling from Susa in the east to Sardis in the west. And it passed through the ancient sacred city of Nineveh. And there were stations with horses every 15 miles, and it would take 7 days for a letter to travel from Susa all the way to Sardis. And in 500 BC, Darius I created an extensive road system for Persia, which is modern-day Iran, including the Royal Road, which was one of the finest highways of its time and was still in use after Roman times. Of course, the Romans built Roman roads, and from about 312 BC, the Roman Empire built straight, strong stone roads throughout Europe and North Africa in support of its military campaigns. And at its peak, the Roman Empire was connected by 29 major roads moving out from Rome and covering 53,000 miles of paved roads. In this map here, as you can see, starting from the left in the west, bordering the Atlantic, Toledo and modern-day Spain, through Gaul, which is modern-day France, and Massilia, and then also passing through Milan. Of course, the nexus was Rome itself, and then moving east to Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, and Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and through Athens, Greece, around through Turkey and Anatolia, all the way down to the Middle East and Damascus, modern-day Syria, Jerusalem, modern-day Israel, into Egypt, in Alexandria, in the ancient city of Memphis, and then west to Carthage, which is located in modern-day Tunisia. So when the Romans built a road, they hollow out an area and fill it with flattened sand. Then they put stone slabs in a primitive mortar or cement. Then they covered it with crushed stone, also mixed in a primordial mortar or cement. And then they put smooth stone blocks, and they would crest the road itself for drainage, and they dig drainage ditches on both sides. And Romans were the ones who came up with sophisticated roads. Now, the Silk Road, and it was derived from the lucrative trade in Chinese silk, spices, and porcelain, connected the West and the East from China to the Mediterranean Sea, beginning around 207 BC. Now, it was a significant factor in the development of civilizations in Asia and Africa. It opened long-distance political and economic relations between civilizations. As you can see by this map, the red line, which starts from the right side in the east in China, hooks off into India, travels across the steppes of Russia, through Persia, and across Anatolia, northern Arabia, to the Mediterranean in the Middle East. And the blue lines denote the maritime routes that were taken by ships. Now, after Constantinople fell in the year 1452, the Silk Road became too dangerous and too expensive. It was a toll road for caravans of merchants and pilgrims. And this explorer, Christopher Columbus, decided to sail west to reach the Far East. Now, in the 8th century AD, many roads were built throughout the Arab Empire, and the most sophisticated roads were those in Baghdad, which were paved with tar. Tar was derived from petroleum, which was accessed from nearby oil fields in the region, and through the chemical process known as destructive distillation. Even in ancient times, though, transport by river was far easier and faster than transport by road, especially considering the cost of road construction and the difference in carrying capacity between carts and river barges. Barges could carry much more weight in goods. Now, the early North American explorers, we called them the Vikings, and archaeological digs revealed that about 1,000 years ago, Vikings settled in the northwest area of Newfoundland known as Lanso Meadows. And it is presumed that they took the Viking Trail, which modern-day Newfoundland Labrador Route 430 is a 260-mile-long paved highway that traces along portions of the alleged exploration trail used by the first Norse settlers. We're not sure, but there's still archaeological digs that say that they may have gone along the coast, starting from St. Anthony, I love that town, been there many times, all the way through Port au Choix, Portland Creek, and down to Deer Lake. Now, I'm going to talk about conquistadors. I'm not a fan of conquistadors. It was started by Columbus. He was the first conquistador. Then Hernando de Cortez the Killer, then the Pizarro brothers. They destroyed the Aztec and Inca civilizations, respectively. But in terms of the continental United States, it was 1528 when Cabeza de Vaca, which means cow's head, with a Spanish expedition exploring Florida, got stranded there. They built barges and sailed along the southern coast of the United States and landed near Galveston. And Cabeza de Vaca was one of the 4 ragged castaways who were among the first non-Indians to set foot on Texas soil. Now, after being shipwrecked, he traveled by foot for 8 years across the Southwest. And you can see the map here, starting with Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, onto Cuba, up to the west coast of Florida, Tampa Bay, and then barges by the Mississippi River Delta, and eventually they were marooned in Galveston, Texas. They would head towards Mexico, cross the Rio Grande twice, eventually heading south through Tenochtitlan, which had collapsed by that time, Mexico City, and into Veracruz. And there they traded with various Native American tribes before reconnecting with Spanish colonial forces in Mexico in 1536. And then there was Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. It's in search of precious metals, the metal that has caused war and shed so much bloodshed, the metal that drives men insane, the precious metal gold. And he was a Spanish conquistador who searched for El Dorado, the city of gold, or the 7 cities of gold, from 1540 to 1542. And he was the first European to discover, quotation fingers, he was not indigenous, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, but he would leave decimated Native American settlements in his wake. Like most conquistadors, he brought his guns, his germs, his steel, his broken promises, and his alcohol in his devastation. Hernando de, and you can just see here the route that he took. He essentially started in Compostela, headed along the western coast of Mexico into Arizona, across New Mexico, through the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, and finally into Kansas. And then there was Hernando de Soto, another Spanish conquistador who led the first European expedition deep into the territory of the modern-day United States. You can see his route beginning in Florida, up through Florida. He'd go through Georgia into South Carolina, eastern Tennessee, down through Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and eventually into Texas and Louisiana. And he was the first European to cross the Mississippi River. Now, some of the swine brought by De Soto was escaped, and it became the ancestors of razorback pigs in the southeastern United States, much larger than the domesticated pig that we know of, hideous tusks from underneath. And as I mentioned, the 6 beasts that were brought to North America: the horse, cattle, chicken, goats, sheep, and pigs. And of course, the University of Arkansas uses the term razorbacks for its team out of the University of Arkansas. And then modern horses were introduced by North America when some escaped with Cortez's expedition in 1519 in Mexico, as he forged across the peninsula to confront Montezuma and the Aztec tribe. And some horses would escape. They would propagate and proliferate, and within 150 years, there'd be over 1 million horses roaming the plains of the United States and Canada. Now, the first English colony in the New World took place in 1585, located in a place called Virginia, which was named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. Of course, they followed footpaths that were already there by the native inhabitants and game trails. And John White, who helped fund the settlement along with Sir Walter Raleigh. He left for supplies in 1587, got caught up in the war between England and Spain, and he wouldn't return until 1590. And at that point, the colony had disappeared. It was known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And all he found was an inscription carved into a tree that said Croatoan. We still don't know if that's where they fled to, if that's the tribe they had a conflict with, but twice they attempted to establish the colony and twice they failed. And when you see these colonists come here, they're grossly unprepared. They're not familiar with the terrain, the weather. Not any of them were seasoned farmers. They hadn't done any manual labor. A lot of them were white collar, religious dissidents. And what would happen is they would get into conflicts with the native inhabitants. They would seize the grain and the food stores of native inhabitants, and that would lead to conflict. And that's what happened in Jamestown. April 1607, the Virginia Company of London plans to colonize Virginia for profit. Originally, they thought they'd find gold, but then they found this exotic plant that was becoming all the rage in Europe called tobacco. And during the voyage, John Smith was charged with mutiny, but was spared when orders were unsealed that designated him to be one of the leaders of the new colony at Jamestown. And again, they used footpaths and trails to hunt game and also for exploratory probing. And invariably, they would come into contact and conflict with the native inhabitants. But at Jamestown, there was starvation and disease, and somebody seemed to perish almost daily. And then you've heard the tale of Pocahontas. Allegedly, Smith was captured by the Algonquin Indians in the lead of Powhatan, but allegedly Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas spared him. These are Smith's words. At the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father that I was safely conducted to Jamestown. So he followed some trails back to the settlement. He was a great explorer, but I tend to think that he was a great exaggerator of his accomplishments. But if it weren't for John Smith, maybe we wouldn't have been settled by the English. So he returned in 1614 with 2 ships to explore and map the area north of Jamestown, which he would call New England. Smith had 2 ships, one that he led, one by Thomas Hunt. Smith would fill his ship full of cod and beaver pelts and head back to England. Thomas Hunt would stay here and, again, get into a conflict with the native inhabitants. And I tend to believe that the Great Dying, as it was called, that took place from 1616 to 1618 in the region of New England, that left native tribes decimated by the smallpox. I tend to think that it actually began in Patuxent in the year 1614. It was brought by this man, Thomas Hunt, who was in the John Smith expedition. But either way, Smith would name the river that he found, which was known as the Massachusetts River, named by the Massachusetts tribe. He would rename it to Charles River Charles after King Charles, and he'd name a cape on the North Shore that we know today as Cape Ann. He named it after Cape Anna, the princess. But he he probably disembarked in Watertown, went up the Charles River and probed a little bit, but on his way up the coast, he went by an area in modern-day Cohasset in a rocky area that has taken many, many ships over the centuries, known as the Glades. And there he got into conflict with the native inhabitants, the Quonehasset tribe or the Conohasset tribe. Smith exchanged gunfire, killing one of the native inhabitants and wounding another in the leg. And the Pilgrims who left England in early September 1620 spent 66 days at sea. They would sight land on November 9th. Their captain would try to take them south towards the colony of New Amsterdam, but the weather would prohibit them from heading south. So the original intention was Jamestown, then New Amsterdam, but they decided to anchor the Mayflower, their leaky ship, in Provincetown Harbor on November 11th, 1620. And that same day, not only would they draft the Mayflower Compact, which was an early constitution, but they also sent an exploration party of 16 men in a shallop to look for fresh water. Now, in 1620, the Pilgrims would spend 5 weeks exploring Cape Cod before they even sailed to the abandoned village of Patuxet that they would rename Plymouth. And after spending several weeks at sea, the Pilgrims resolved not to set foot on land until the Mayflower Compact was written and signed. So they would eventually land, first landing November 11th, looking for fresh water. They would find corn at Corn Hill, or steal it actually, and they left a note that we'd pay you back later. So essentially that was the first act of American credit in commerce. And then they would encounter the Nauset at First Encounter Beach, half a dozen Nauset Indians with a dog, a timeless moment. They stood eye to eye, 100 yards, 200 yards apart, and the world would forever change. The natives' world would forever change, and they hustled into the woods, and they were there to stay. The Pilgrims were there. So I'd like to take something from a dissertation known as Pathways of the Past, Part 1 by Maurice Robbins. It's from 1984 in Bridgewater State University. So both the Indians and the English selected sites for villages with the same characteristics in mind. They needed good drinking water, cleared land for planting, etc. And consequently, many English settlements occupied the sites of former Indian towns, and thus the original trails were continued in use. At first, the English traveled on foot, as had the Indians, but as horses became readily available, trails became bridle paths, and they were widened. And eventually, wheeled vehicles were introduced for inter-village travel, and as the traffic increased, the old footpaths were again widened to permit their use. So two-wheeled vehicles came first, but they were quickly replaced by four-wheeled carts that could carry greater loads. So now these trails became roads. They were straightened at some spots, widened to allow for passing, and abrupt turns that were difficult for four-wheeled wagons to negotiate were eventually eliminated. Now, as the unoccupied areas between towns were laid out and occupied as farms, houses, and buildings, they appeared by the roads, and resistance to any change in location of the right-of-way stiffened. So farmers and settlers didn't want people to put roads through their area or divide their lots, and this situation tended to maintain the status quo of the early network of roads. And after all, what farmer would welcome a new piece of road that cut through his cultivated fields and pastures, and who was willing to have his land cut into two simply to straighten out a road? And another development which also tended to perpetuate the road system was the growing use of paths to delineate property boundary lines and town and settlement boundary lines. In those days, it was costly and difficult to run long lines through the virgin forest. You had to hack down trees, cut out vines, undergrowth. So it was much easier for them to make use of an already established path. For example, the Five Men's Purchase in Middleborough was bounded on the north by the Lower Plymouth Path and on the south by the Upper Plymouth Path. I know it doesn't make sense, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And such instances were made possible, the definitive mapping of a portion of an old path. So colonists would forge paths, especially out of Plimoth Plantation, on expeditions usually led by Miles Standish, along with John Carver and Edward Winslow. And they would follow Native American game trails, and they found or made paths along the coast or inland routes on Cape Cod. And that's where they recovered John Billington, a boy who got lost and kidnapped and was subsequently returned by the Nauset tribe. Now, the Billingtons were those bad next door neighbors. They tended to get into a lot of trouble. In fact, John Billington was the first pilgrim executed. You can read up on them. So in Plymouth, there was a path known as the Nemasket Path, and it was probably the first Indian path known and used by the Pilgrims. This well-trodden path led inland from their seaside settlement at Plymouth to an area abounding in freshwater streams and ponds known to the Indians as Nemasket or Nemasket. And it was known as the place of fish, that was the term, because it was the largest alewife run on the eastern seaboard. And you can see it here to go from Plymouth, probably in a southwesterly direction down to the Bristol, Rhode Island area. Now, not being too familiar with the Eastern Algonquian language or tongue at that early date, the English understood the name to be that of a particular Indian town located somewhere in the vicinity of the Wading Place, a ford on a small river, that's a shallow area where you can cross the river, known as the Nemasket River, which is near modern-day Middleborough or modern-day Taunton. And you can see this is the first area of contact, but this is essentially where the path would run to the Narragansett Bay region. So at this shallow place in the river, the Nemasket Path connected with several trails that led north, west, and south to various Pocahontas towns. And there it broke off into two distinct trails, the lower Plymouth Path, which is actually upper. You can see it there with red arrows, and then the upper Plymouth Path, which is below. We go through Middleborough. You can see some modern day roads of Forest Street, etc., into Taunton. Now, it was probably the route that was taken by Samoset when he walked into the fledgling Plymouth settlement on Friday, March 17, 1621. He was an Abenaki sachem, a leader, a chieftain, from the Maine coast when he, quote, bodily came into the Plymouth settlement and he greeted the startled men in English. He said, "Welcome, Englishmen. My name is Samoset." He reputedly said that. And this is in a language that he had learned from previous English explorers. And then, of course, he asked for beer. Another reason why the Pilgrims decided to come ashore was to look for fresh drinking water because they had run out of beer. It was very dangerous for them to drink fresh water that was taken on board because diseases or waterborne viruses would fester in their barrels. And of course, Samoset explained that he was acting on behalf of the Pocahontas, who were their neighbors to the west. And it was a path that was frequently taken by the men of the Pocahontas from the seat of the Wampanoag Federation, which was a series of tribes under one leader, Massasoit, a sachem, in the modern-day Bristol, Rhode Island region. So you can see that's the area of the Wampanoag. You can see the Nemasket from Patuxet all the way down to the Rhode Island border where the Pocahontas were. And of course, you can travel along the Nemasket Path on certain sections of today's modern-day Route 44. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony began in 1630. The second settlement, founded by English colonists, they founded Boston. And it quickly became the political, commercial, financial, religious, and educational center of the New England region. The first white settler was William Blackstone. He arrived on the Shawmut Peninsula in the 1620s. Now, Blackstone was an English clergyman. He was left alone in his home atop what was later Boston's Beacon Hill after his party had returned to England, and he became very friendly with the local native tribes and traded with them. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony's first governor, John Winthrop, led the signing of the Cambridge Agreement, calling Boston, quote, a city upon a hill. And they called it Tremont or Trimontaine. And it's a reference to a hill that formerly had three peaks: Beacon, Cotton or Pemberton Hill, and Mount Vernon or Mount Horton Hill. Cotton Hill's today modern-day Pemberton Square, and Mount Horton is now today modern-day Lewisburg Square. And of course, you've heard the term, Tremont Street, Tremont. But the hills were leveled and used as landfill for the expansion of Boston in an area known as Back Bay, and along with debris from the Great Fire of Boston that took place in 1872. Now, the Shawmut Peninsula was known to be inhabited back to 5000 BC. It was a promontory, an isthmus, and it was founded in 1630 by Protestant Puritans who came from Charlestown, again in search of fresh water. And they named it after their former home in Lincolnshire. And roads quickly developed from pathways in their village as they ventured across the causeway known as Boston Neck. And you can see some of the settlements here: Plymouth 1620, Boston 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony, same year, Duxbury 1637, Dedham, Massachusetts 1636, and so on and so on. Gradually, these trails became heavily traversed thoroughfares between the colonies and villages. Now, I'm going to be referring to this map quite often in my presentation, but let's look at this one along the coast. It's called the Coast Path, or the Old Coast Road, or the Old Coast Path. You can see it there in fuchsia, the red circle, and it follows modern day Route 3 or 3A. And the first route was used between Boston and Plymouth, and it was designated as a public highway in the year 1639. It traveled for 45 miles, and you can travel that today on Route 3A, and they made it a toll road in 1803. And again, you can see it heading to the northwest from Plymouth to Boston. Now, the initial westward movement away from the Atlantic coast began in the late 17th century, and by the mid-18th century, the frontier land had been removed at places up to 200 miles inland. Like the westward expansion that would take place in the 19th century, settlers were driven by the pursuit of inexpensive land suitable for farming. Of course, land that they didn't own. Although conflicts with Native American inhabitants sporadically interrupted early migrations, by the first decades of the 18th century, early 1700s, many colonists had used their conveyances to successfully establish settlements well into the interior. In fact, westward migration from the New England colonies occurred in a similar fashion, although there were other factors besides securing land for crops. Environmental conditions were also an important consideration, as the rocky soil of New England, especially along the coast of Massachusetts, was poorly suited for farming. Rocky, acidic, sandy. And strict religious Puritan requirements alienated many New England colonists and spurred a lot of them to move west in pursuit of religious tolerance and moderation. In the early 1630s, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony ran short of grain, in fact, Nipmuc Indians in the Connecticut River Valley loaded some of their abundant surplus maize, corn, into their birch bark backpacks, and they walked and trod a familiar route to settlements at the mouth of the Charles River. There they traded food for European goods like copper, iron, and wool. Now, Watertown was organized by English Puritans in the year 1630. It was first known to the settlers as the Saltonstall Plantation, and it was one of the earliest of the Massachusetts Bay Colony settlements. Sign here that settled by Puritans in 1630 under the leadership of Sir Richard Saltonstall and the Reverend George Phillips, who stood firmly for religious toleration and the right of the people to a representative government. Founded in 1630, Saltonstall and Phillips found Watertown, Mass., and today there is a monument along the banks of the Charles in Watertown to Richard Saltonstall. But the Watertown town seal had on the bottom of it, it says, "In pace condita," which means founded in peace, and references the peaceful interchange of goods trade, notably a bass for a biscuit between Roger Clapp and Native Americans in the year 1630. And you can see that denoted on the seal. Now, Clapp had explored the area of Watertown before the Puritans came up the Charles River. I always thought it would be a cool name for a pub in Watertown or a restaurant, the Bass and Biscuit. But some of the records of Clapp and Saltonstall, they listed sunset of the stream of passenger pigeons passing overhead at sundown. It took 15 minutes for this huge, enormous column of passenger pigeons to pass overhead. Of course, the passenger pigeon was very smart, but it was docile, and it was moved to extinction by the early 20th century. There's also the Watertown Path, and this is the trail that led from Boston to Watertown. It passed through modern-day Cambridge, and it was known as the Watertown Path, or modern-day Brattle Street. That's what lies upon the actual Watertown Path, which traveled all the way to Charlestown, or formerly Charleston, and it was known as the Old Indian Trail. In fact, this sign says the way to Charlestown, Washington Street, Somerville, and Kirkland and Brattle Streets Cambridge, skirting marshes and river, followed the old Indian Trail from Charlestown to Watertown. Along this way in 1636 went the Reverend Thomas Hooker and his congregation to their exodus from Cambridge to Hartford in Connecticut. So fur traders and the exploratory party of John Oldham, 1633, 3 years before he moved west, penetrated this first of the trails west into the continent's interior. And if you look at the old Connecticut Path, it runs by various names, and it depends on the historian that you look at in terms of, is there an old Connecticut Path or an old Connecticut Path, as I call it. But historian Ayers traces one route, and then Spice, he has an old Connecticut Path in his chronicles, but it leads all the way to the Connecticut River into Hartford. And in fact, in 1635, some settlers from Watertown took this route when they removed themselves to Wethersfield, Connecticut. Now, Watertown, there's a sign there that says settled by Puritans under the leadership of Sir Richard Saltonstall and Reverend George Phillips, which held firmly for religious tolerance and the right of the people to a representative government. Thomas Hooker, 3 years after he explored and probed the interior in 1636, Hooker took his followers, New Englanders, and they moved into the lush Connecticut River Valley via the old Connecticut Path, and they spread out into other fertile regions of New England. Much easier to grow crops here than the lousy soil of eastern Massachusetts. And the sign here says Thomas Hooker Trail. Crossing the highway at this point is the Indian Trail, followed by the Reverend Thomas Hooker in 1636, when with his invalid wife, born on a litter, had led a company of Massachusetts settlers to found Hartford, Connecticut. And they followed what I call the real old Connecticut Path, or the Great Trail, which meandered along the Pioneer Road, another term for the old Connecticut Path, from Boston to Hartford, Connecticut. And you can see it here, traveling from Boston through South Framingham, Hopkinton, Upton, etc., right through Wayland, Weston, and all the way through Webster, Mass, and northern Connecticut, Woodstock, all the way and on to Hartford. So Hooker had 100 of his outcast congregation, and luckily he had 160 cattle that he drove with the troop, and they drank the milk en route. And they followed the old Connecticut Path. It took them 2 weeks' journey to the Connecticut River Valley, where they settled in a place the native Lenape Indians called Suckiog because of the blackness of its earth, the richness of its soil. And they founded the English settlement of Hartford. And by 1643, documents in the village of Sudbury called this trail, quote, the old Connecticut Path. Now, in 1635, William Pynchon set out with 2 Indian scouts prospecting for beaver skins and fur. First, they came to the New World looking for gold. No gold. Then they decided to set a plantation, grow tobacco. But then came the beaver fur, thousands and thousands of pelts. And then John Smith would fill his ship full of over 10,000 beaver pelts, along with cod, and before he headed back to England. But Pynchon was so impressed with what he saw in the Connecticut River Valley that he asked the colony to grant him a permit to explore the western lands, which they did. Now, in the spring of 1636, he set out with his own family and other people of Roxbury to follow the Indian Trail and blaze a path through the wilderness to the desired lands along the Connecticut River. We would call this the Bay Path. You can see it here, traveling east along modern-day Route 20 through Weston, Wayland, Sudbury, Marlborough, Leicester, etc., all the way through Springfield and then down the Connecticut River Valley. So the Native Americans, they called this the Bay Path because it traveled from Massachusetts Bay to the Hudson River, a distance of about 160 miles. It was first used by John Oldham in 1633, moving from Jamaica Pond all the way out to Springfield, a distance of about 92 miles. So, long native usage had emphasized the easiest route, skirting the water meadows of the river bottoms, crossing streams at the most dependable fords or lowest points, the shallow points of the river. And the path led west along the north bank of the Charles River from Newtown, which became Cambridge. And they moved to the newly settled Watertown areas, and they passed through what are now modern-day Waltham and Yorktown, Weston. It then curved southward, where it entered the southeasterly section of the new town of Sudbury, which was now set apart as Wayland, where a section of the route still bears the name Old Connecticut Path, right there in green. And you can see it here in red as it passes. And a lot of the roads that we travel, including Route 9 and Route 20, pass along the old Bay Path, the Old Connecticut Path. And in Wayland, the Bay Path was later called the Boston Post Road. And it would diverge from the Connecticut Path, headed west through Marlborough, Worcester, and Brookfield, straight towards the Connecticut River. And the old route is still followed for part of its length by Massachusetts Route 9 and Massachusetts Route 126. And this is a section of modern-day Route 126 right here in Wayland. So in Sudbury, the Connecticut Path was known as the road from Watertown to the Dunster Farm, for after passing alongside the north side of Cochituate Pond. The trail crossed the Sudbury River at an area known as Danforth's Farm, which in 1700 was incorporated as the town of Framingham and later, just recently, the city of Framingham. But the Connecticut Path headed west, threading between the Charles and Sudbury rivers on its way to the Connecticut River. And I found this in the Journal of 1769. It states, from Framingham to the Old Connecticut Path runs southward through South Framingham and Hopkinton, Grafton and beyond, through Westboro, over to the Woodland Greens, and then west to the bank of the Connecticut River opposite Hartford. And you can see it there, just south of Worcester. Back to our map. This is the area we're talking about, the Old Connecticut Path, which travels along the modern Massachusetts Turnpike and areas. And it's also parts of the Boston Post Road, and also known as part of the King's Highway, all the way down to Hartford. Now, the Pequot Path, the first war conflict between the settlers and the native inhabitants was the Pequot War, or Pequot War of 1637. And the Pequot Path, or Pequot, interchangeable, a Native American trail that traversed south and westward to the land of the Pequot Indians. And it was the earliest traveled highway used by the English settlers of Rhode Island because it connected the settlements of Providence and Westerly. And you can see it right here, denoted in purple. And it's also covered by the Lower Post Road, which would become King's Highway. And this area was also called the Old Roebuck Road. This early colonial route was one of the principal roads that came out of Boston. And at Providence, it connected with the Pequot Path to form a link in the chain of paths, which would eventually reach from Boston to New York, over which a monthly post was established about the year 1690. And this would later be one of three prongs of the post road known as the Lower Post Road. And there it is there. You can see that, traveling through Dedham and crossing into the Bristol area, all the way to Providence. Now, here's another one here that we're going to be showing you here. This is basically covers modern day Route 1. There was colonial encroachment. Indian reaction to colonial encroachment in New England was fierce. The second and bloody battle was known as King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. And after that war, most native resistance was eliminated. And King Philip, by the way, was the son of the Sachem Massasoit. And the colonists killed him, cut his head off, and put it on a pike. Gruesome, outside of Plimoth Plantation. It stood there for decades. But anyways, they opened up the interior of New England now to migrant farmers. Okay, and what they used was the Boston Post Road. There's three versions of the Boston Post Road. The upper road, denoted in red, the red dotted trail, the middle road in dark blue, and then the lower road in the light blue, which moved along the Connecticut coastline all the way down to New York. So the Boston Post Road was created in 1673 as a crude riding trail and mail delivery routes that turned it into one of the first major highways in the United States. The first post rider's journey of round trip with mail was a journey of over 250 miles. It would take 4 weeks, 2 weeks down, 2 weeks back, usually following the upper northern route of the post road because the middle route was a bit shorter, but the southern route was a bit longer, but they like to use the upper post road. Now, the lower post road, which today is modern day US Route 1, which travels along the shore via Providence, Rhode Island, all the way to Greenwich, Connecticut. That's a lower post road. It's 270 miles long. And by 1800, a 10-hour stagecoach ride you could take from Boston to Providence. Today, it's an hour. And a portion of the lower Boston Post Road was originally part of the Plimoth Path from Providence to New London, Connecticut. Back to our map. There you go, the Plimoth Path. So the Middle Post Road, which diverged from the Upper Road in Hartford and ran southwest from Boston, was John Hooker's Old Pioneer Road, Old Great Trail. Okay, so the Post Road, called the Pioneer Trail, the Old Indian Trail, the Great Trail, the Old Connecticut Path. It stretched, though, for 225 miles, all the way into Connecticut. And the Middle Post Road split off from the Lower Post Road, which is the old Route 1 in Dedham, and it progressed along modern Route 16 and 109, proceeding along modern-day Route 44 to Mansfield, Connecticut. And the Upper Post Road, which today is modern-day U.S. Route 5 and U.S. Route 20 from New Haven, Connecticut by way of Springfield, Mass. 250 miles long, all the way to Hartford. Now, all of the roads, the Boston Post roads, all three, eventually took you from Boston to New York City. And the first stagecoach service took place in the year 1772, and you could go from Boston to New York in 1 week. Today, it's a 4-hour drive. The post roads were used for maneuvering soldiers and equipment, and they became important links between the states of the new nation as sections of the road were improved. This is the mile 8 marker on the Upper Post Road in Harvard Square, 1734. Back to our map, the Bay Road now. The Bay Road, not to be confused with the Bay Path. Essentially, it follows modern Route 138 in portions of Route 24 as well. It's ran from Boston through Stoughton and Taunton to New Bedford, a distance of about 60 miles. You can see there, it's the olive color. It was a toll road, but traffic would decline after the addition of the Taunton-Boston Railroad in 1835. And then the boom of the railroad took place in the 1840s and 1850s in Massachusetts. And then what about the Worcester Turnpike? It was the Massachusetts legislature chartered a system of private roads or turnpikes that were designed to help facilitate travel and commerce. And it ran from Roxbury, where tolls were collected, and it's essentially modern-day Route 9. Right there. Now, in 1664, King Charles II informed his governors in New York, which was recently captured and taken from the Dutch, formerly known as New Amsterdam, and New England, that he would be pleased to have communication established between his colonies, both New York, Boston, and Plymouth. So the Boston Post Road was actually a segment of the King's Highway, which ran from Massachusetts to South Carolina, arguably from Maine to South Carolina. Essentially, it was a system of post roads to deliver mail and trade, containing some of the first major highways in the United States. Now, they would call it the King's Highway because long before travelers reached New York City, they would pass farmers with wagon loads of produce, teamsters carting in fresh water, young men taking their ladies out for a drive in one-horse chases. And stagecoach service between Boston and Providence began in the year 1767. So you can see here the red line marking the King's Highway. In various parts in Maine, it was called the Kennebunk Road, Boston Post Road, the New York-Philadelphia Post Road, the Pequot Path in Connecticut, the Delaware Indian Path in New Jersey, the Great Coastal Road, the Potomac Trail, and the Great Savannah Trail in Georgia. And you can see it goes right through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, all the way to Savannah, Georgia. Now in Maine, the Kennebunk Road ran from Kittery to Calais, and the first section was built in 1653 to connect Kittery in York to the city of Boston. And the road was soon extended to Portland, Maine, and the route was expanded and upgraded to a military road in 1761. Today, this historic road approximates U.S. Route 1. Beautiful drive. So the King's Highway, if you can see the map to the right there, it's a network of Indian paths that they turned into postal trails, and then they turned them into important colonial American wagon and stagecoach routes for settlers along the Atlantic coast. However, the sea route was still easier and safer, and as late as 1704, they found the lightly traveled postal road to be difficult. after rains and snow, potholes, overgrowth. So it was still more cost effective and quicker to travel by sea. And safer, actually, because they didn't have any conflicts with the Native Americans. And during the Revolutionary War, the King's Highway, which included the Boston Post Road, became the mustering point for several of the Revolutionary War battles, including the final battles at Yorktown. And a lady of courage by the name of Sarah Knight made the journey in 1704, and she recorded her impressions in a journal. She said the food at the inns was poor, but that was the least of her problems, as the fording or crossing of rivers during rainstorms was difficult and what she described as terrifying. And she referred to the road as the King's Highway, but that came into disfavor during the Revolutionary War. The colonists were trying to free themselves from the tyranny of Great Britain, or the perceived tyranny of Great Britain, and they didn't want to call it the King's Highway. It's a post road. So along many sections of this route today in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, the name Boston Post Road or Post Road is still used. And the modern highway, Interstate 95, crosses its parallel side roads, but it still exists on some portions of the former King's Highway. Now, regular stagecoach travel could be accomplished between Boston and New York by the mid-1740s, but the journey was uncomfortable. Dust, heat, rain, snow, all contributing to a miserable experience. Can you imagine if you had back problems and you rode one of those primitive stagecoaches? You'd be hurting. So a trip out of Boston might begin as early as 3 o'clock in the morning. You'd be on the road for 17 hours and 60 miles. Then you'd have a short night in bed at a crowded inn where you'd have to share the bed with maybe 2 or more people. And then the next day, more of the same, grueling. But by 1750, a continuous road existed for stagecoach or wagon traffic from Boston all the way down to Charleston, South Carolina, on something known as formerly the King's Highway. Just a side note, the first Concord stagecoach, built in Concord, New Hampshire, wasn't built until 1827, but it greatly improved the stagecoach riding experience. The Abbott Downing Company in Concord, New Hampshire, employed leather strap braces under their stagecoaches, which gave a swinging motion instead of the jolting up and down of a spring suspension. So, as citizens of the new nation sought increasing travel for more and better inns, they popped up. They were here to help feed the hungry and weary travelers, so the food got better. And as the stagecoach driver would approach a tavern, he would sound his horn to announce to the tavern keeper that hungry passengers were arriving, and he could also attend to his horses. Now, the food of these inns as they developed were quite good, and there's still some great inns along these old routes, including the Colonial Inn in Concord. And John Adams, on his first trip to Philadelphia, when he was venturing from Boston or Quincy, Mass, to the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he was quoted as enjoying a meal of ducks, ham, chickens, beef, pig, tarts, creams, custards, jellies, trifles, beer, porter, punch, wine. And for a portion of a stage journey over rocky roads, the carriage would be replaced by a cruel wagon without springs, as a carriage with springs would have turned over and crashed and injured the occupants. And then where traffic was known to be light, passengers might be transferred to a charity drawn by only 2 horses. This, of course, was done for economic reasons, cheaper. But Springfield, Mass. was an important junction point, especially for the traders. It was a fur trader center from Albany, which was the major fur trading center. And by 1772, as I mentioned, stagecoach from Boston to New York was cut down to just 1 week. Let's look at the Mohawk Trail. It began as a Native American trade route connecting Atlantic tribes with tribes in upstate New York and beyond, following the Millers River, Deerfield River, and crossing the Hoosac Range in today's northwestern Massachusetts. You can see it there in fuchsia. And of course, it was taken by settlers or explorers who came back from the west. They'd come back to Massachusetts along the Mohawk Trail, or known as the Iroquois Trail in New York. And today it's parts of Routes 2 and 2A, and it follows much of the original Indian Trail from Athol, Mass. To Williamstown, Massachusetts, a distance of about 69 miles. And of course, the manifest destiny. By the time that journalist John L. O'Sullivan wrote an article in 1845 declaring to citizens of the United States that it was, quote, our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Well, construction of the first macadamized road in the United States had already begun. And I'll talk to you about that, what a macadam road is, just in a moment. But the migration westward was dramatically increasing as settlers headed into uncharted territories throughout the rural West in search of fertile land and a better life. The brash young American nation wanted to stretch its borders while remaining indifferent to the consequences of their actions. This was not their land. It was a democide, a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic genocide of the native inhabitants. And the Wilderness Road was the principal road that was used by settlers for more than 50 years to reach Kentucky from the east. People in Kentucky were known as cane tucks. And this man, Daniel Boone, in 1775, trailblazed for the Transylvania Company from Fort Chiswell in Virginia through the Cumberland Gap into central Kentucky. You can see the map there. It was later lengthened following, again, Native American trails to reach the falls of the Ohio at Louisville. And it was a steep, rough, narrow trek, and it could only be traversed on foot or sometimes by horseback, no wagons. But despite the adverse conditions, thousands of people used the Wilderness Road. And you can see it here, the map showing the Wilderness Road cutting through the treacherous Cumberland Gap. And in 1792, the new Kentucky legislature provided money to upgrade the road, and in 1796, an improved all-weather road was opened for wagon and carriage travel. And the road was abandoned around 1840, although modern highways do follow much of its route. Now, the National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road and later U.S. Route 40, was the first major improved highway in the United States built by the federal government. It was a historic national road traveling from Maryland all the way west to Illinois. And between 1811 and 1837, the 620-mile-long road connected the Potomac and Ohio rivers and was a main transport path to the west for thousands of settlers. It was rebuilt in the 1830s. It became the first U.S. road surfaced with the macadam process, pioneered by Scotsman John Loudon Macadam. You can see it traveling from all the way from Baltimore to St. Louis. Now, when I talk about macadam, it was similar to the way the Romans made roads. It was single-sized, crushed stone layers of small, angular stones placed in shallow lifts and compacted. And then a binding layer of stone dust is applied, rolled and covered with a binding agent, a primitive mortar or concrete. And again, they got the idea with the crusting road for drainage from the Roman roads. And of course, the Panic of 1837 halted the construction of this road. And that's why they halted it in Vandalia, 63 miles northeast of St. Louis, Missouri. But it's much of that historic national road is followed. It follows along modern day Route 40. And there were extensions, including west to St. Louis, and it was called a historic national road or an all-American road. And of course, there are other trails that headed out from St. Louis: the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, California Trail. Trails westward for the expansion. Of course, gold was discovered in California in 1849, and thousands upon thousands of people set west in search of striking it rich. The Bozeman Trail, for instance, the Fort Smith, Santa Fe Trail, the El Camino Real, etc. Southern Trail. Texas had an upper and lower road. And then there were other, like the Cimarron Cutoff and Spanish trails, and the Mormons with Joseph Smith. He would lead them to the Salt Lake region. And there are southern, north, and south routes, cattle trails known as the Chisholm Trail or the Shawnee Trail, the Western Trail, etc., etc. And then the old Spanish Trail, which traveled throughout the Southwest. Again, you can see some of the older trails here on this map leading into the Republic of Texas and beyond. And of course, the old Oregon Trail as well. A lot of settlers made it to the Pacific Northwest. And Manifest Destiny promoted American imperialism, yes it did, and tried to justify the war with Mexico in 1836. Remember the Alamo, right? But the three basic themes of Manifest Destiny were the special virtues of the American people and their institutions, America's mission to redeem and remake the West in the image of agrarian America, an irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty. They were stealing land. They wanted to strike it rich. After they had originally come here in the early part of the 17th century for religious toleration, now it was to find good, rich land to grow crops and to make money. And of course, Democrats endorsed the idea, but many prominent Americans such as Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and most Whigs rejected this. And John Quincy Adams repudiated expansionism because it meant the expansion of slavery in Texas. But here's the question you need to ask. Was it unbridled capitalism that drove overzealous Anglo-Saxon immigrant opportunists and their lust for wealth to seize land under the guise of noble exploration, whereby they could systematically enable a pogrom to eradicate its native inhabitants? And then finally, in 1918, the National Highway System, including Route 66, Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he was going to build a government-funded wagon road along the 35th parallel. It became the historic Route 66. I've had the pleasure of traveling along that in Arizona. Lovely Route 66. And it was also known as the Will Rogers Highway, the Main Street of America, or the Mother Road. Get your kicks on Route 66. It was one of the original highways established within the U.S. highway system in 1926. 2,448 miles from Chicago all the way to Los Angeles. Of course, you know the song, Get Your Kicks on Route 66. There was a TV series as well. And it served as a major migration path, especially during the Dust Bowl, during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the road supported the economies of the communities through which it passed, and businesses along the routes became prosperous due to the popularity of the highway. And it was officially removed from the United States highway system on June 27, 1985. And finally, let's wrap it up with transcontinental I-90, longest interstate highway in America, 3,020.5 miles. There's the red line you see along the map. It's the western terminus is in Seattle near Safeco Field, where the Seattle Mariners baseball team plays. And the eastern terminus is in Boston at Route 1A in Logan Airport. And the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstate and defense highways was built in the 1950s, authorized on June 29, 1956 by the Federal Aid Highway Act. And of course, it was built to evacuate citizens, because this was during the first Cold War, and move armies and weaponries along thoroughfares. So imagine a traveler from earlier centuries experiencing smart driverless automobiles, radio traffic reports every 10 minutes, texting while driving, mall parking on Black Friday, or mobile videos and internet on demand, or even having the AAA. We travel the same roads as our ancestors did in just a fraction of the time that they did. So think about that the next time you're riding home on these ancient interstates. Like when you're traveling on Route 128 North and Route 1 North, but you're also on Route 93 South at the same time. I often like to say that Route 128 has no soul. So my name is John Horrigan. Thank you so much for joining me today on this presentation provided by the WAYLAND Council on Aging. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.